February 16, 2025, Studio 8H NBC, the SNL 50th Anniversary Special. The room is full of the biggest names in entertainment, 50 years of comedy history being celebrated in one night. And then, from a seat in the crowd, an 87-year-old man in a dark jacket, tinted glasses, and a Yankees beret leans forward toward a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Sandler." 5 words. The room erupted. Adam Sandler spun around, pointed at the crowd, and yelled, "That's Jack! Jack made it out tonight!" Jack Nicholson smiled. And then, like a ghost that had decided one appearance was enough, he went back to his seat, watched Sandler perform, and went home to the house on Mulholland Drive where he had been living, almost entirely unseen for 15 years. The next morning, photographers caught him leaving his hotel, walking with a cane. It was the clearest image the world had seen of him in years. And in those photographs, in the gap between the man in the beret and every memory the world held of Jack Nicholson at his peak, was the real story. Not a comeback, not a farewell tour. Just 5 words, a round of applause, and a man who had already made his peace with everything. This is how Hollywood's most untamable force became its most private disappearing act. To understand Jack Nicholson, you have to start at the very beginning. And the very beginning was a lie. He was born on April 22, 1937, in New York City. His teenage mother, June, had traveled there from Neptune, New Jersey, to give birth quietly, away from the gossip of a small town that would not have been kind about an unmarried young woman and a father who was already married to someone else. So June's mother, Ethel May, made a decision. She registered herself as the baby's mother. June became his older sister on paper. The boy who would grow into the most magnetic actor of his generations was raised believing his grandmother was his mother and his actual mother was his sister. Nobody corrected the record. Nobody told him. In 1954, when he needed papers to travel to California, a birth certificate was filed that reinforced the fiction. He would not find out the truth until 1974. He was 37 years old, already famous, already defined. A researcher from Time magazine called him while preparing a cover story and told him what no one in his own family ever had. The woman he'd called his mother his entire life was actually his grandmother. The woman he'd called his sister was actually the woman who gave birth to him. By the time the truth came out, both women were gone. June had died of cancer in 1963. Ethel May had died in 1970. There was no one left to ask, no conversation to be had. Just the truth, landing cold and irreversible, too late for anything to be done with it. Nicholson's response, when asked about it later, was almost eerily calm. He said it was dramatic but not traumatizing because by then he was already formed as a person. Maybe. But the boy who grew up inside a lie about who his own family was became a man who kept the entire world at a carefully controlled distance for the rest of his life. That detail doesn't go away just because you name it calmly. His first job in the entertainment industry was not acting. It was running errands at the animation studio where the creators of Tom and Jerry worked. He carried mail, he fetched coffee. He watched the machinery of show business from the very bottom of it. When the studio offered him a full-time animator position, he turned it down because it came with a pay cut. Shortly after, the animation division closed entirely, and Nicholson drifted toward acting almost by accident. He trained at the Players Ring Theater, where a former actor blacklisted during the McCarthy era taught him something that never left him. Great acting wasn't about performing emotion. It was about absorbing life so completely that the emotion became real. For the next decade, he appeared in roughly 15 films and had almost no name recognition. He started writing screenplays out of desperation because nobody was offering him leading roles. And then, a piece of luck that wasn't really luck at all. The part of George Hansen in Easy Rider, the role that made the world stop and look at him, only came to him because another actor dropped out after a violent argument with the director. Nicholson stepped in, and in a film that became a cultural earthquake in 1969, he was the thing everyone walked out talking about. What followed is a run of work that has almost no parallel in American film history. 5 easy pieces. Chinatown. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which won him his first Oscar and swept every major Academy Award. The Shining. Terms of Endearment, which won his second. Batman, where he negotiated a profit-sharing deal that reportedly earned him between $60 and $90 million. A Few Good Men. As Good as It Gets, which gave him his third Oscar. 3 Oscars. 12 nominations. 40 years of being the most dangerous, most unpredictable, most completely alive person in any room he entered. And then, after one more film in 2010 that barely made a ripple, the gates closed. The films get talked about constantly. The personal life gets glossed over as a punchline about a man who loved women and didn't settle down. But look at it more carefully, and a different picture emerges. For 17 years, Jack Nicholson was with Angelica Huston, one of the longest and most complicated relationships in Hollywood history. It ended at dinner, in a single conversation, when he told her that another woman was going to have his baby. Huston, who had struggled with her own fertility, understood immediately. She told him there was only room for one woman in the picture and she was stepping out of it. 17 years, one dinner, over. The other woman, Rebecca Broussard, gave him 2 children, Lorraine in 1990 and Ray in 1992. That relationship also eventually unraveled. Later came Laura Flynn Boyle, and when that ended, Nicholson was in his late 60s. In 2013, in one of his last extended interviews, he said something quietly devastating. He said he was no longer driven to be out there anymore, that the only films he cared about were ones dealing with real emotion. And then he admitted that, during his last few movies, he barely left the hotel room at night. For a man whose public life had been as legendary as his film career, the Lakers' courtside seats, the sunglasses, the grin that made tabloid photographers follow him across 3 continents, that sentence was a signal. The engine had changed speed, and when an engine like that slows down, it tends not to start back up again the same way. The rumors started almost immediately. In 2013, a report claimed he had stepped away because of memory loss, that he could no longer remember lines well enough to work. People close to him pushed back. A source said he was still reading scripts, still considering projects, just not committing to any. In 2017, he was briefly attached to an American remake of the German film Toni Erdmann. A real project, a real return it seemed. Then he stepped back and the production collapsed, director James L. Brooks later confirmed that Nicholson was still reading scripts all the time, which is a strange and haunting detail. The door was never closed in his mind. It simply never opened in practice. By 2021 and 2022, reports described a man who rarely left his Mulholland Drive compound, physically stable, but living inside a world that had contracted dramatically. His children had become his primary companions. The industry had stopped expecting him. The public had started wondering. Then in 2025, a source close to Nicholson gave what might be the most honest assessment anyone had offered. They said he didn't like to be seen much in public anymore, that he'd been spotted at a hotel and was a little wobbly, that his appeal had always been built on an extravagant character and lifestyle. And then this line, Jack and his inner circle prefer that people remember him as he was. That is not the statement of someone in crisis. That is the statement of someone making a deliberate, fully conscious choice. Jack Nicholson is not hiding because he is broken. He is choosing to protect the version of himself that the world loves. The man from The Shining, the Joker, McMurphy. He would rather those faces endure than let cameras catch an 88-year-old man with a cane and a diminished step. There is no single reason Jack Nicholson disappeared from public life. It was his body changing, his energy shifting, an industry that had grown into something he no longer recognized and that no longer quite knew what to do with him. Relationships that had burned bright and ended. A life that had been so extravagantly lived that the quieter version, by contrast, felt almost like a different existence. And beneath all of that, something more deliberate. A man who had spent his childhood inside a lie about his own identity, who had spent his adult life being watched by millions, deciding that the final chapter would belong entirely to him. He knows what legacy means. He built one carefully, over 40 years, without once being predictable. And he understands that the image stays cleaner when you stop feeding it new material. So he reads scripts he doesn't commit to. He has dinner with his children. He checks in with friends who have known him since before anyone in the world knew his name. He sits in a house on a hill above Los Angeles, surrounded by a version of the silence he absorbed as a boy without knowing what it was. And once, in February 2025, he put on a Yankees beret, walked into Studio 8H and said 5 words into a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Sandler." Then he went home. That is not a tragedy. That is not a cautionary tale about fame or age or the cruelty of time. That is a man who gave the world 4 decades of the most alive, most dangerous, most unforgettable performances in cinema history, and then decided, on his own terms, that he was done. Jack Nicholson didn't lose Hollywood. He let it go. And the silence he left behind says more than most actors manage in an entire career. Subscribe. Drop a comment. What's your favorite Jack Nicholson performance of all time?